Welcome. Thank you very much, everybody, for braving the heat to find the cool here. Joining us this evening. We have, one sec while I get my bearings. All right. Tuesday. We're in the middle of the month of July. July is Disability Pride Month. Raise your hand if you have a disability or know someone who has a disability. Raise your hand if you have a disability or know someone who has a disability. Okay, welcome. All right, Disability Pride Month. My name is Jessica Morris. I co-chair the Planning and Urban Design Committee here at AIA New York. The Planning and Urban Design Committee is a platform for practitioners to test innovative strategies and advocate for just livable neighborhoods. There will be a point in tonight's program where you're invited to take out your phone to follow some links via QR, but just silence if you haven't already. And if you're having trouble hearing me, flag and we'll speak up. So we're here in partnership with a couple of other committees at AIA New York and some other partners beyond. The Historic Buildings Committee and also the Diversity and Inclusion Committee. Committees here at AIA work together, practitioners in a pretty horizontal platform to engage on issues that matter and develop programming to have professional conversations, public-facing conversations about topics that are timely, that relate to either the professional audience, public audience, both, allied professionals, others who are engaged in that kind of work. We've also partnered on this Legacies of Redlining program series with Open House New York, who's been a great partner, and the Historic Districts Council, which is a unique cross-section of nonprofit entities engaging the city. So we have a fantastic collection of minds and speakers, knowledgeable parties who are going to share a little bit about their insights across this question of the legacy of redlining on Staten Island specifically, and tie that into some of the work they do relative to preservation paradigms and the current development climate there. So we're going to have then a discussion thereafter and opportunity to also meet one another in the room and engage in that discussion thereafter. So if you can do a little bit of self-introduction, everyone, our speakers, we've got Fallon, Dr. Fallon Samuels-Aidu, who's here from not New York, I'll say, and we're very glad to have coincided in scheduling. But if Fallon, you can give a little bit of a self-introduction. I'm going to forego all of the bios. Others, Judah, Amy, John, and Victoria are relatively local. Some for local, we mean Staten Island. For some local, we mean here in Manhattan and beyond. But we're all here as one kind of New York family. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over, Fallon, to you to start us off, and then we can continue rolling into the program. So thank you very much for joining us tonight. And please feel welcome to mill about if you need. Get up and water's over there. We want everybody to be healthy. Gotta get pretty close to the mic. That goes forward. This is a pointer that turns the screen off. And that goes forward.
Okay. And also, so hopefully it'll turn the screen off. All right. I'm a little shorter. Just a tad bit, though. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out. I am not currently a local resident of the city or the metro area, but I was born on Staten Island. I grew up in metro New York, and I am very much still a part of the community with all of the family, lots of the family that that reside here in the city and outside of it. Um, I am, yes, a professor, teaches real estate and historic preservation, as well as a practicing preservation planner who works with community-based organizations and governmental entities. But I am going to take a different attitude tone today. I'm not here to speak at you, lecture you as a professor, but rather to engage in a conversation with you about what's happening here in the city and what's going on elsewhere. So I hope you'll join me in that and everyone else in that conversation. Um, just to get started, the title, as I told the organizers, is one of those things that all have to do. You have to distill it into some words, but it can be misleading. Redlining is a lot of things, which I'll talk about in just a minute. But it's also not all that it is in terms of real estate and race being entangled with one another, as well as class, nationality, religion, ethnicity, gender, so many other ways in which people identify themselves as people in place. And I've highlighted here some of the big ones that have shaped the way in which we can see it on a map, because redlining maps have become such an iconic way of knowing inequity and racism. But all of the things that are presented here can actually also be mapped and are being mapped actively in various projects going on. I really invite you to check out resources that are provided here, but there's a great number of books that you have to purchase and sites that you have to maybe pay a paywall to access that are also really great resources. I think that we're most familiar as a kind of general audience with the big things that movies have been about, TV shows and shows up on social media, which are the racial violence that still is going on, frankly, and the restrictive covenants, as well as the ways in which lending institutions and insurance providers, including our federal government, have been active agents in distributing inequitably access to our built environment. But there's a number of less obvious and explicit ways in which racial differentiation of real estate unfolds. Planning, where the profession and discipline in which I have been trained is currently and has historically been a major perpetuator of racial thinking about lots of things, even when that's not the first and foremost way in which they're seeking to act and seeking to change a place. So you might be trying to zone out nuisances like manufacturing, but where you decide that the manufacturing can go is just as much about just determining who can be sacrificed, whose health can be put at jeopardy in order for you to move forward with your plans. And by the same token, what places need to be preserved, need to be restored ecologically in order to have a healthy community is just as much about making spaces safe for some and not for others. So I throw these out here at the beginning because in the span of time that we have today, I can't possibly discuss them all. If you have not yet seen any kind of redline maps of Staten Island, today's your day to get but they're not all that different from any others that you find for a place across the United States. Not all cities were mapped in the same way. Some cities were mapped more frequently than others. And more importantly, the federal government, the Federal Housing Administration, upon enactment of the Federal Housing Act in 1939, did not have the capacity to engage in really fine-grained assessments of the built environment across the entirety of the United States. it relied heavily upon local appraisers, local real estate agents, which is why many people might have read at some point in the last 3 years, The Color of Law, because it was propagated very much after the summer of 2020, and it puts a lot of emphasis on the federal government's role in racializing our built environment. But quite frankly, it was a very scrappy agency with not a lot of bureaucrats actually employed. It was a lot of contract work to the Realtors Association, to the Appraisers Society, to local real estate agencies. So what you're seeing here, as far as what's considered the best, is what people in Staten Island and working in this region felt was the best. And I want to just point out that there is one of the things that you can take away from these descriptions is how textured they are. There's a lot of detail about the topography, about the architecture, not just about people's racial identities. And that was used just as much as the racial information to determine the risk tolerance for the respective investors. Yes. Oh. Yes. Sorry. Yes, that is green. Yes. For grade A, this is yellow. For grade B, yes, this is definitely wrong colors for accessibility month. This is not the disability that I have, though. See, well, one could say with my glasses it is the middle kind of category of undesirable is a hodgepodge of a lot of things, and the last of hazardous, you'd be surprised how much the agency relied upon the industry partners to actually be the ones to help them determine which areas were hazardous, because that was where they actually wanted to site their own facilities. So I'm going to speed up and just let you know that besides having been born here, I have a very personal connection to the places that have been graded in this way. My aunt was able to purchase a property just on the edge of that yellow and in that red. And because there were manufacturing companies that were both allowed to and seeking to site their properties where it was cheapest, this is one of the areas that saw quite a lot of what's called amongst preservation and architectural professionals a loss of integrity of the neighborhood through demolitions and changes in use. It's a personal perspective that I have to check, however, because many people that my mother, father, and their siblings joined in community with were displaced altogether and lost not just their home, but their connection to the community that created a healthy environment for them. And that continues to go on. And so while members of my family were participants in many of the planning that preceded the current plans, these current plans are one of many that are affecting the ability for people to actually engage in current decision making about what happens to places that are have personal attachment to them. One of the things that I've been doing in my work is assessing the ways in which not so much people, but properties have been kind of extracted from a framing that, let's say, historic district boundaries within the boundaries or landmark boundaries. And because the way we coded what was in, also known as contributing to a district, and what was out, non-contributing, affected what could be saved and what couldn't be. And this is a project that's across many geographies, but this is one of these properties that would have been counted as contributing if the preservationists were interested in making this area a historic district, because it retains a lot of the integrity of its predecessor, which is from the tax photographs of 1940. But you can see a lot of the island has not been subject to designation. And so that's just one example of many in which we can and should be reflecting on the ways in which we thought we were just paying attention to what architecturally is retained in the wake of renewal and redevelopment, but we could be looking more critically at our own ways of thinking about the promises that we made, and I say we because I'm a part of these professions, and the processes that we use, even as we try and make those make redress. And I note that yes, there are lots of equity frameworks at play and at work right now, but that doesn't mean that they don't also, oops, going backwards, they don't, oh, I did it. They don't also need to be redressed. And so I want to leave you just with 3 slides, one kind of teasers, which is to say that this is long-term work. I was a part of this project in Newark in the early 2000s, and over many administrations, it is still not in its final phase of development and involved a lot of people stepping out of their box, visually and otherwise. In other cases, there's a situation where funding gets raised and funders step away, and people lose access to capital because the restrictions that were placed on it don't meet the ways in which the organizations granted them operate. And as a result, partnerships that were built over lots of years start to crumble and falter. And while we may now be able to say, oh, it's a historic district, great, but can we say that the partnerships that were built along the way are also sustained, have been preserved? And so I'm hoping that that's not the case where in New Orleans, this was just, I serve on the National Register Review Committee in Louisiana, and we just managed to have the area of Lincoln Beach placed on the National Register. And this is just another example of one of many places that is in an area historically and currently that lacks considerable investment. And preservationists are now incredibly invested in its revitalization. But it is also, why now and not 10 years ago, people are asking. And you have to be ready to answer those questions, but also ready to sit with people who want to tell you why it's problematic that you weren't here 10 and 20 years earlier. Because there are consequences to missing those chances. You can't always come in 10, 20 years later and say, well, we're here now to make this a historic district. We're here now to restore this, this neighborhood. And that, you can do a lot of good work together in that time, but what can also happen is that considerable heritage gets lost in the meantime, and several processes might get installed that are hard to unravel. And this is what's happening on Martha's Vineyard, where I've been doing a lot of my work lately. I've been working quite closely with the African American Heritage Trail of Martha's Vineyard, and I can say that it is another island with many similar challenges to here. People think of it as very unique because of its celebrity status, but like here, in New York City, within each of the boroughs, there's a strong, you could say, disinclination to change the path that people are already working along. And so I encourage you all to fight that tide as you move forward. Thank you.
We'll get to this later as well, and sorry, it's a little bit out of order, but this will come back around. It's a link to a set of resources that relate to some of the histories that Fallon alluded to. So if you have interest in engaging further, going a little bit deeper, it will come up again. So if you don't have your phone ready to zoom to the resource page just yet. So we're going to move from a broad perspective to more specific with John.
Thank you. Thank you, Fallon. That was great. There was so much in there, and I'm looking at it saying, wow. Hello, everyone. I want to say thank you to Open House New York, Historic Districts Council, the AIA, for inviting me. I'm currently the Vice President of the Preservation League of Staten Island, established in 1977. We're the only, oh, did I? No. We're the only island-wide preservation advocacy organization. I guess it is Staten Island, it's a small island. So we've been advocating for the historic built environment. As we move forward, Fallon had a couple of slides with regards to natural areas and environmental justice communities are becoming more important. I'm going to try to context this whole thing. So, Vice President, moved to Staten Island in 1992, been there over 30 years, more than half my adult life. And I like to say the preservation bug bit. I first came, I was living in Queens, met my now husband, traveled past Snug Harbor, and I said to myself, growing up on suburban Long Island, South Shore, I came through, if you've been to Snug Harbor, I went there and I said, what is this magical place? It sounds kind of corny. I'm not going to focus on Snug Harbor because that's a whole topic, but I start to see the historic old houses, most of the houses on Long Island in certain parts are 1970s, 80s, and so forth. And as I started to get more involved with it, got involved with the Preservation League, and it's just been a kind of, we're all volunteer group. And I started to realize this was a passion that Staten Island had such great, having lived in Long Island and New Jersey, as many people maybe in this room kind of pass across Staten Island, take the ferry, get off, go back, and they don't see the interior part of Staten Island. So fast forward, I've been with the Preservation League since 1996, currently have a historic house that I think as that bug kept saying, hey, you're here to do something. So my husband and I renovated a 1887 historic Victorian, actually in the heart, and I was telling some of the folks here, I knew redlining growing up, but I didn't know what was different about Staten Island. So I would see these neighborhoods that I'm right in, I don't have a pointer, but right at the top of the island, right near the ferry. Is there a pointer? Oh, there we go, thank you. So roughly in this area, the New Brighton, Tompkinsville, St. George area. And you can see quite a bit of red, but it had quite a bit of beauty in terms of the historic nature. I'm going to just go to the next slide. So in a context with Staten Island, again, there's a whole history there, but originally, sorry, I'm going to go back one more. At the turn of the century in the 1930s, there were only 3 bridges. The one bridge that was connecting into the rest of the city was the Verrazano. Again, opened the development gates to Staten Island. And I think as the redlining that occurred in the 30s with the Homeowners Loan Corporation, as the 30s rolled into the 40s and these older neighborhoods were hitting 50, 60 years of age, particularly my house by the 1930s was almost 50 years old. It's now over 140. Those houses were not looked at as desirable houses. There was this, well, let's move. And the southern part of the island had so much open space that I've said that, and I see that today. My day job, I'm the director of Conference House Parks, so I'm right down here and illustrating in 2 opposite ends, Tompkinsville, Tottenville. There was so much open space that if you grew up on Staten Island, if you lived in Brooklyn or Queens, you moved to Long Island. My parents grew up in the Bronx. You moved out to another borough, the suburbs. Staten Island, you could have had the older neighbors. I meet many folks on Staten Island who grew up, oh, I live on West 12th Avenue, an old street. Oh, I lived on Westville. I lived on Hendricks. And these folks now live in, and I saw this as it was happening in the more desirable as this area was getting older. And then the South Shore, they could have a new house that was built in the 60s or the 70s and still be part of the same borough, so they have a connection. They didn't have to flee, but it made the southern end of the island develop very rapidly. I have this picture here, the 1960s rezoning legacy. I have a friend and colleague from the St. George Civic here, Tamer, that as a preservation, you can't just be preservation, because we are actively fighting. I'm going to talk about Bailey Seton very quickly. Bailey Seton, we're helping out now with sandy ground, historical sandy ground in the southern end of the island. But rezoning, I'm seeing it now, that this is a shot of Richmond Terrace and Franklin Avenue. And the zoning legacy is what we're seeing with these storage units. So right now, if anybody's driven on Richmond Terrace, we probably from St. George by the ferry all the way to Mariners Harbor, which is on the northwest shore, at least 10 of these storage facilities. I don't know how much, and myself and others say, how much storage do people need? Whether you have a home, whether you live in an apartment. Oh, wow, goes fast. This is something that we're very well aware of. So across the street, and Fallon mentioned what type of industry you want. Right across the way, this is was the former gypsum factory in Staten Island, New Brighton. It employed many people in the neighborhoods. But the 1960s, they said, manufacturing was starting to leave. They said, oh, let's just keep it all of the northwest part of the island. I'm going to go back, and I know shoot. Yep. So this whole fringe is all manufacturing. It's also an environmental justice. You did see the slides with the Staten Island Urban Center. Kelly Villar is a good friend. She's fighting. So they're coming together, because now preservation just can't operate in a vacuum. So this is something that we're addressing to say with the civics, that this has to change. The zoning has to be. There are no supermarkets. There are no mini marts. There are no. My husband jokes, there's no Fannie Mae's little cooking shop or supermarket. So this is something that the horse is out of the barn. So we're really trying. We're working with our elected officials. The other thing that has happened, and didn't have a chance to get a shot. This is a 1964. You have the historic district, edge of the historic district on Richmond Terrace. There's west of one end of my street, and you have the Richmond Terrace houses. So what happened, and this is happening, it happened in the 80s when development was going crazy. Public housing was put in certain areas of the city because it was redlined, legacy of Robert Moses in part. There's nothing wrong with it, but what happened on Jersey Street, which is another nearby redline neighborhood, they did with quote-unquote urban renewal. So all the houses, all the buildings were taken down. Residential developments are there. Very much involved with the new 2024 development, but there's no buildings to have businesses go in. So when we get a new business, it's very exciting. So that's a legacy that right in this area, myself and friends that live right here in the apartments, there's no supermarkets. There's nothing in and around that. Real quick, I know my time's running. So one of the goals at the Preservation League, and this is Bailey Seton, located just further down, not far from Alice Austin House, on the waterfront in Clifton, Rosebank neighborhood, and this is it. Let's go back here. 1931, landmark structure. The league has been very much pressing to have this saved. It's demolition by neglect is occurring. There's another shot of it. We've been meeting with our elected officials, our councilwoman, the borough president. The community board has sent a letter of support that landmarks preservation, which you can love and hate at the same time, really needs to step up. As you can see, the terracotta or the stucco is falling off. This copper trim is being taken very much. Here's the building again. So we've been pushing that. One of the things with adaptive reuse, we're not anti-development. We want to see this site developed. It has, and I can talk afterwards with the questions, it has a dual personality. It's owned half by the Bailey Seton Hospital Corporation, which owns this, and in front was the Salvation Army, which tore down all the non-landmark buildings. So we have this vacant area, and we'd love to see it developed. We'd love to see it developed correctly. And with this site, it was public. And this is, I was talking to some of the panelists, this was a public site back when it was the first public health hospital. Turned over to the city, and it was private, so now it's sort of this quasi-private, but it really would impact what Victoria does at Alice Austin. It has many, and we're going to talk about this, and I know you're many implications. We're just concerned that it's going to be, excuse me, you know, all of a sudden, again, on Staten Island happens all too often. It goes from suburban or to rural to suburban and then urban too fast and not in the right way. And if you've driven through Staten Island, it's throughout the whole island. I know my time is up. Thank you. And if there are questions, I'm here. Again, this was great, and I look forward to this continuing because as the vice president of the league, we're always constantly challenged with different things. And I also have just a little plug. I have some information about the league if you're interested to know what we're doing. But again, thank you. And next. Yep. Oh, so thank you. Yes. So this is the current view taken by me. So everything in the front is the Salvation Army, and right at that fence. And I've been rallying this with landmarks, which if any of you have landmark property or you work with landmarks, we don't regulate use. But when you have the copper being stripped, Barnett Shepard, who started the league, has talked about this. The copper trim is taken, there's graffiti, the windows are going, and this is finally stepping up to say, all right, the Bailey Seton Hospital Corp needs to step up and secure this. And we met with the borough president. We were saying, this is our legacy. We don't need, and he said once, I'm running over, but he had said when we were meeting with the wheel site, when we were referring to the Staten Island wheel that has failed miserably. He once said when the developer came in and said, hey, Vito Casella was the congressman, thank you. He said, we're going to give you a wheel that Staten Island can be proud of. And I said this back to Vito. He goes, we don't need to be proud of. We have a nice history. And I reminded him what he said, and I said, it stuck with me. This is the same thing. This is our legacy. Because Staten Island, this was front and center to the harbor. It was 5 miles to lower Manhattan. At the time, before Brooklyn and Queens and the Bronx came into the picture, Staten Island was it. Because you could get to and from lower Manhattan in a blink of an eye, and that was the earlier development of states and so forth. So it resounded with him because this isn't Little Susie May's house that we're trying to protect. We've moved away from doing that because you don't want to force landmarking. This is landmarked, but it's found, and so thank you. Sorry for that.
The other way? All right. Hi, everyone. I prefer the computer, but that's good. Hi, everyone. My name is Victoria Munro. I'm the Executive Director of this Alice Austin House, located on the North Shore of Staten Island, very close to, obviously, where we were just discussing. I'm also the board president of the Museums Council of New York City, which is 116 institutions across 5 boroughs. And I serve on the executive board of Historic Artist Homes and Studios for the National Trust. I fell into preservation by buying a house in John's neighborhood back in 2008. Mine was from 1843. Right on Richmond Terrace, just a stone's throw from the ferry. And I didn't even drive. I never thought I'd need to have a driver's license living in New York City. And I discovered that it was a food desert, and I was constantly back on the ferry and into the city just to get simple things that I needed. For years, I've sat on committees to lobby for waterfront access, to lobby for green space, to lobby for amenities for these areas. And finally, through my education background, I began to write programming in women's history for the Alice Austin House in 2015, and I became the executive director in 2017. When I took over, the Alice Austen House was completely focused on its architecture, not on its story. There was some change starting to happen, but there wasn't really a meaningful connection to people that lived on the island, to people that pilgrimaged there, particularly the LGBTQ community. So Alice Austen left us a legacy of around 8,000 photographs of a changing New York City, but also a very important set of historical photographs of the women that she socialized with, LGBTQ pre-Stonewall photographs of a Victorian era on Staten Island where people were flourishing, and also her queer circles were. This is taken on the edge of her lawn, and I can't talk about the work that I do without showing Alice and her work. Alice was completely enmeshed in her surroundings, which are now the historic park. I have 15 acres to work with. Alice celebrated her plants, she partied, she was a socialite, but she also worked, going too fast, a little bit on the fringes, but with inside of how society functions. So she formed all of these clubs that were acceptable for women to be and do without men, such as the Staten Island Garden Club, the Staten Island Bicycle Club. And so she was really pretty ingenious for her era to create safe spaces for her and her circle of women, largely queer women. She was also friends with many queer men. So to take over the house in 2017, I was presented with a house that was interpreted as a historic home. It was full of antique furnishings, and in fact, the first time I visited the house in 2008, when I was looking to move to Staten Island, by the time I left, after around about a 3 to 5 minute look around, I had no idea that Alice was a photographer. I had no idea she was a queer woman. And that would have meant a lot to me, an artist who identified as queer and a curator. So the process of transformation was relatively fast because I think the train had left the station. We had just had made an amendment to our landmark designation to become, to include LGBTQ history as an area of significance. And my role here tonight is more about talking about how you can connect place and space with people today, how we can work within preservation to include younger generations, which is so important for the work that we do, and certainly presenting historic artifacts that didn't even belong to Alice Austen because she was evicted from this home, ignoring the breadth of her life and the fact that she was completely marginalized by the early 1950s as a lesbian woman, which she wouldn't have called herself a lesbian, but we call her that today. So I transformed the spaces into open, accessible spaces for education to completely explore the themes in Alice's life and work. Formerly, we had player pianos that didn't work, that Alice never owned, furniture that Alice never owned, only 3 of her photographs on display. We now have over 150 photographs on display, and we center the loving narrative of her and Gertrude Tate's 55-year relationship, 30 of which was spent at the house. So having achieved that restoration in 2019, it is time to turn our attention to what are the landmarked grounds of the property. I wanted to recognize that not everyone wants to cross the threshold of the museum, and that's okay. So the largest amount of visitorship that we have is to our public park. We're the first green space that's openly accessible from the Staten Island Ferry towards the Verrazano Bridge. So if you haven't been, it's around about, 6 to 8 minute drive. It's a very hard walk and a very hard bicycle path. So building off of Alice's legacy as the president and founder of the Staten Island Garden Club, I created last summer a Queer Ecologies Garden. So really exploring how we connect horticulture with our education, but also looking at this legacy to create art in the garden and create safe space that acknowledges the LGBTQ history. So a Queer Ecologies Garden includes plants that are non-binary, that intersex, historically, symbolically queer plants for LGBTQ community. And this year it is being extended to the entire driveway of the house, and we're starting to extend it to the meadow. So part of what we do as preservation programming now at the Alice Austin House is really invite new strategies to ask questions of how we can connect to the past. And we teach over 6,000 students a year. We teach every single Gender Sexuality Alliance on Staten Island. Those are our queer kids and their allies. We also teach queer seniors, and we host various community groups to gather at our space and look at different ways of asking questions of how we relate to history. We also just launched a sister website for our Queer Ecologies Garden, which we're building on day by day with resources and all of the work that our kids make. What I want to say as well is that we, of course, because of the legacy of Alice Austin's impact and the artwork that she created, I curate 9 contemporary exhibitions per year, and artists are invited to also make interventions within the house. And within the public park, we also provide community space at no charge, but that we staff and we don't get funded for them to hold their concerts and events. So it's a constant battle, but in 2017, I was the only full-time staff member, and now I have 5, and we're a staff of 14. And we're the little museum that could, and I think that we're an example of the power of what museums can do with preservation to connect and inspire and make stories relevant today. And without all of that contemporary programming, we wouldn't have all of the critical views and reevaluations of Austin's work that never existed because she was closeted, because she was a woman and she wasn't well known. But she deserves to be. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Amy Gross. I am president of Amy Gross Architects. We are a firm that's going to be 40 years old in 2 weeks, and I consider us to be activist architects. Our clients are not-for-profit organizations that are mission-based and are committed to creating housing, healthcare, and other services for disenfranchised and people that are on skirt poverty. We started doing work in Staten Island about 15 years ago because it was a time of the recession, frankly, and we were looking for work, and I am a native New Yorker, and I realized I knew nothing about Staten Island. And I do want to say that, can you hear me? I just realized this wasn't. That just listening to my colleagues on this panel shows you the breadth of what Staten Island is about, and how it became a safe space for people of a lot of different backgrounds and identities. And what's particularly ironic about it to myself is that doing work as an architect in Staten Island is basically a secretive, difficult, and stressful job. And that is because the minority of people who live in these green neighborhoods have control over the rest of Staten Island. So what you see on this map is Tiffany in our office overlaid the projects that we've recently done in Staten Island against this 1930s and 1950s redlining districts. And I remember the gasp that I had when she was done to see how our projects absolutely echo this redlining area. And we are in about 10 different neighborhoods, some of the neighborhoods that have already been discussed here, but what you can see is that, in a sense, poverty breeds poverty, right? And that even in these areas, which are very primarily low income and don't have the same kind of services that other districts have in Staten Island, we still get a lot of pushback to make these projects happen. So I just wanted to go through some of the jobs that we've done, working with primarily two very, very strong non-for-profit entities. One is Project Hospitality, who provides the most amount of social services in Staten Island, and the other is Chazzy, which is another entity that is based on Bay Street and does work all around Staten Island. This project was done as a reaction to Sandy. So Sandy happened in 2012. Good parts of Staten Island were completely decimated because part of the redlining issue is that it's also about environmental issues. So many of the areas that you saw on these various maps are close to the shore of this relatively small island. They have very high water tables and it's very hard to build there. So if you start to play out laying over the environmental issues with the sociological issues, you understand why these red line districts exist. So this van was designed by us as a way of distributing health care to people throughout the borough. What's been interesting is as time has gone on, it still provides health care in terms of HIV and hepatitis testing, but it's also providing benefits analysis, so people can come into the van. As you can see, it has private offices, and learn about getting into Obamacare, getting involved with helping with housing vouchers. The idea is that it's a mobile unit that provides services to the community. This is 411 Vanderbilt, which is owned by Project Hospitality. I do want to just step back for a moment and say that our firm, I'm very proud to say, has designed beautiful, beautiful buildings for very affordable means. Working with Staten Island has allowed us to step back and understand that as architects, not everything we create has to be beautiful. It just has to work, and it has to provide a roof over people's homes. So 411 Vanderbilt had been vacant for 10 years. It took years to even find out who the owner was, and it took years to be able to purchase the property. At the groundbreaking, if you will, there were 4 of us in a dark room because no politicians showed up, no press showed up, and no one wanted to talk about it because the fear was that while we were under construction, if other people in the community found out that poor people with issues were living there, that we wouldn't be able to proceed. So in our office, no one was allowed to talk about the project. If anybody called, nobody knew anything about it. And when the building opened about a year and a half later, it was the first project that the state of New York, under the Empire State Development Fund, funded. There were people from the state, there was one person from the bank, and there was one politician. And that is still very much an issue. It is certainly getting better. And I think, Victoria, when you were talking about Alice Austin House, bringing people to Staten Island and making them even understand what goes on there really does contribute to people having more empathy. This is a project that in our 40 years, that I think I'm the most proud of, which is, this is an extremely ugly building. We don't have a picture of it. But in it, which again was abandoned, but in it, meals are served. And I reached out to our client before I speak to you all, and I just wanted to read to you. I asked her how many meals were served and distributed from this facility. And she wrote, in collaboration with the Robin Hood Foundation, Project Hospitality served a total of 1,140,000 465,966 meals to hungry Staten Islanders in 6 months from July to December of 2023. These meals supported approximately 13,595 individuals and 5,348 households within the Staten Island community, based on an average household size of 2.5 people. We are currently on track to meet the goal of distributing 3 million pounds of food by June of 2024. So basically what this tells you a lot, right? It tells you that there's significant poverty in Staten Island. It tells you that there are a range of people that require these services and that the need is so profound and it's hardly being met. So in this 3-story building, the first floor is a kitchen where it can seat up to 120 people for 3 meals a day. Upstairs are various services related to health, and then downstairs are various services related to housing, taxes, that kind of thing. So this little building is a part of distributing 3 million pounds of food. I can't even wrap my head around what that means. But the issue is that Staten Island became the last resort for a lot of facilities that help people. And I think when you showed the picture of Bailey Seton, which our firm has visited many, many times, Staten Island is interesting because there were a lot of social service not-for-profit organizations that provided services to people. And somewhere along the way, when the island became more suburban and when it became more middle class, a tide turned in a sense, and it went from being a very, I would call it a philanthropic borough, to actually turning its back on it. And for us, the challenge is how we as architects can be a part of making it philanthropic again. So I'm going to end on this building called Castleton Avenue. It is right in the area that you've heard about. It is the first supportive and affordable housing new construction in Staten Island of this size. It's 44 units. It includes apartments, both supported and affordable. It includes a food pantry and a community center. One of the other things that's really interesting about the demographics of Staten Island is that there's a huge cohort of primarily South American construction workers who live in Staten Island. And as you know, that's a very dangerous business, which we deal with every day. And the group that you see are identified here, the people with the orange t-shirts, are of a part of this community center called El Centro, which provides services to these construction workers and their families. So the need is very, very great, but the opportunity is equally great. But what I find so fascinating is what you were talking about. I never appreciated how all these projects that we're doing came about because of laws that happened almost 100 years ago. That to me, this sort of multi-generational, ingrained kind of prejudice, I really did not understand as an architect. So thank you.
I'll just say to segue, we have one more presenter. She will introduce himself, but if your brain is spinning a little bit with all this information that seems disconnected, just sit tight. We're going to talk about it and figure out how to connect those dots in a way that really, I think, advances the conversation. So,
thank you. Thanks. Hi, everyone. My name is Judah Asamoff. I'm an assistant vice president at the New York City Economic Development Corporation in our neighborhood strategies department. Within our planning division, one of my roles at EDC is project managing a host of different North Shore Staten Island projects. And before I get into some of those projects, I just wanted to take another step back and build on what some of the other presenters are and have said so far, and really zoom in on the North Shore, as I think it's a really interesting area and really different than I think Staten Island exists in the public consciousness. This is the part of Staten Island that is the most diverse, also many of the population centers. As you've seen in earlier maps, many of these areas were also historically redlined. This is where much of multifamily, mixed income housing exists. And it's really interesting. You see on the right, the Verrazano Bridge, which when it opened in the 60s, inaugurated really an explosion of growth in Staten Island. And the North Shore continued on a more urban path, the Mid-Island and South Shore went a different path, more suburban path, and I think some of the anti-development feeling kind of comes back to that explosive growth. But anyway, coming back to the North Shore and kind of the downtown Staten Island area, where most of my work is, many of these communities face kind of a series of interrelated challenges. Low labor force participation connected to a lack of good paying jobs and really limited transportation options, resulting in long commute time. And then, of course, like many other redlined areas, there's a lack of critical infrastructure and services, lack of historically city investment and private investment as well. And then, as Alice and others mentioned, there's this amazing waterfront here on the North Shore with views of the Verrazano and Manhattan, Brooklyn, and yet this was historically a working waterfront, and much of the area today is vacant, blocked off, and contaminated. So before I talk a little bit about EDC and the city's efforts in the North Shore, I want to take a moment to think about engagement in Staten Island. As some of the other panelists have mentioned, it's a difficult area to be talking about housing and development. I think part of when the new administration changed over, when our new president began, a real focus was on, and continues to be, relationship building and recreating connections to the community. I think planning at its core really comes down to relationship building. And so we've been working really hard, and we still have a long way to go, but we're focused on building relationships and connections from local elected stakeholders, community groups, civic associations, down to residents. So we've been making a concerted effort really to just make our presence known, a lot of listening, a lot of participating, and a lot of sharing. But of course, that's really only part one. Part two is actually showing results, and that's what the Staten Island North Shore Action Plan is all about, released in last September by EDC on behalf of the city and in really close collaboration with Council Member Hanks. And this is a 4-year action plan to re-energize, reinvigorate a host of projects that have run aground, dealt with many delays and issues. And really the goal here is to create this vibrant waterfront community, really a complete community with services and housing. And so the centerpiece of this plan is that green ribbon you see in the map, 2 miles of continuous waterfront esplanade, 20 acres, and then along with that, additional housing, over 2,000 homes, and a host of new commercial, retail space, infrastructure, and things of that nature. And another issue that this plan is getting at is also economic and workforce opportunity. So you see there over 16,000 jobs and $6 billion of economic impact. So really getting at some of the challenges on the previous slide. And I wanted to zoom in a little bit on the plan's Stapleton efforts, really focusing in on what's called New Stapleton Waterfront. You see in the map there. So this is really master plan, 35 acres, former Navy home port that had been for several decades largely vacant or underutilized, a waterfront that again has been blocked off, and area that is environmentally contaminated. So when complete here, we'll be having 12 acres of new open space, over 2,000 units. And so really we're talking about community building, a new waterfront community where previously there's largely vacant land. And we're also seeing the ingredients of a new community. So new public school, new services, commercial space, and so on. And here are a few of the different pieces that make up New Stapleton Waterfront. Again, the centerpiece being the waterfront esplanade, which is set to break ground later this year, and will create an additional 6 acres of open space on top of the 6 that was created several years ago. So 12 acres total. And then you see in the other photos, this is a parceled development that will go on over several different years. So you can see a couple of the different renderings. One of the RFPs, or request for proposals, is out now, and we're hoping to have some exciting news in the year ahead. And so you can see here what we're really talking about is community building, getting at some of the issues that we've talked today about, and creating jobs, homes, and new space. Thank you.
So thank you all very, very much. I think going from the interior space of defining a community and an identity, both its past, present, and future, at the Austin House, to the personal connections that people, practitioners, neighborhoods, communities have, and anchoring that in what may be a future, making sure as many of those neighbors can and should be a part of that future in ways that prosperity is not limited. I think so. We're going to invite on Victoria, Amy, Fallon, and Judah to engage in a conversation. The context I failed to mention, while you and maybe I'm not sure if Philip, we can get the lights going a little bit again. Just a little bit of context. So the Redline Legacies Preservation Development, each borough has a different story, and I think Staten Island is unique in that not a lot of people know a lot about Staten Island except Staten Islanders, right? How to understand that the sort of deep entrenchment of the racial legacies that are a part of redlining are also overlaid with the intense environmental degradation that is a part of the North Shore legacy of Staten Island as well. And I think that's where you have a stacked deck up there in those predominantly redlined areas. So I want to just provide a little bit of context, and this is kind of giving behind you, and you'll see all the pink dots on Staten Island. This is from the Landmarks Preservation viewer, so you can download the designation text about each of these individual landmarks to learn about it and why it's important. I think the narrative and storytelling we've learned is a part of who tells that story, what that story is about, and kind of the legacy that gets sort of historicized. It's up to all of us to be a part of creating that, essentially. We're starting to get familiar with how these pieces relate to one another. As we look at the maps that Judah showed, John, your context, Victoria, I think your Alice Austin is down here. Bailey Seton is up in here, and then the North Shore that we were talking about a little bit more is kind of up here. If you can see what we're looking at here, these are the historic districts. Technically, you can either landmark or you can make a district. Those are primarily the tools that preservation has beyond engagement. And this is where we start to see our color blocks that we're learning more and more about how they relate. So it's abstract in what we're looking at, these blobs on a map, but beginning to understand what is really happening there as far as history, time, and communities, I think is where we start to get an understanding. So Victoria, you want to?
So it's my job to be a shepherd right now. And so I'm going to ask my other members, my colleagues here, a few questions, and then we're going to open it up for a Q&A for all of you, and I really want to be respectful of you having some time to ask us questions. But the first question that I do want to ask, and you can raise your hand if you want to take it, is what is at risk of being lost from a cultural memory and heritage perspective through the changes to the built environment taking place on Staten Island, which of course we've just heard about these future plans right now. And I'm kind of thinking maybe Fallon or John for this one.
I think I mentioned Sandy Brown is definitely just had on the 5th of July. And again, I urge you all to go to the Sandy Brown Historical Society website. We had an event, and this was news to me, and I know you know. On July 4th, 1827 is when they abolished slavery in New York State, which is kind of mind-blowing that in 1827 we still had slavery. But Sandy Brown, it sort of has been lost in a sense because Sandy Brown was the first free African Americans for free blacks from Maryland that were oystering in the Bay. They were there for many years. Then, as again, all the things talked about here in Staten Island, they sold off the land, moved for economic opportunities. Suburban development has literally just engulfed this area. So the league is working with the Sandy Brown folks, and I'm happy to say now, we just the league was able to give a $10,000 donation to their restoration project of the building, and then working with them to bring that sense of place. And I mentioned this at the open house here, doing a sense of place. But that is being lost. That's one of the things that came up. There were some folks there at the event, and that is one that is the sense of place is being lost. Unless young people know about that Sandy Ground, they don't come back. They kind of just happens. They're on the North Shore, but Sandy Ground is on the South Shore. They lose that connection. So I think Sandy Ground is one that I would say.
I'll briefly say that a lot of the elder community of color Staten Island had connections to the era of the island, and I think you put it as being a philanthropic borough, but of it being a place where healthcare took place. And so my aunt came as a nurse, and that was a big time career at the time for someone early 20th century. But there were so many who came and survived all of the things that we talked about, and were bringing both their professional knowledge as well as their, place, their being residents of the borough, into the work that people were doing, whether that was ecological related to the landscape, for the environmental movement on the island. And so we're not just losing, artifacts, we're losing the evidentiary basis of all of that that was imparted by people along the way. And one of the ways in which that can't be held on for forever, but can be recovered in part, is documentation, whether that's archaeological or historical, ethnographic, or whatever. People doing film work, the youth that we saw earlier, I saw they were doing different video clips. I mean, there's lots of different educational ways that people can engage in an archival practice of some kind, but that way of forensically taking account of what the cultural memory is, I think, a step before we can even say what might be lost. We don't yet know what's being lost without engaging in the practice of knowing. Right now, I think we're still a lot of misremembering and choosing not to reflect is going on. But there are people who are willing, and I think that willing community needs to be a part of the practice of remembering.
That's so good what you point out about people coming there for those professions. And we have an incredible woman, one of the last surviving Black angels, who were the tuberculosis nurses on Staten Island, Virginia Allen, who's just a power at preservation on Staten Island. Okay, so I'm going to move through to a sort of preservation toolkit. And there's a number of questions that I could ask about this, but I want to shift to this question. In terms of preservation tools or support, what do you need and need more of to further the goals of the work in the community? Maybe Amy could address that a little bit.
Yeah, I think, I was saying that we agreed to be on the CE, so there are a lot of, as there is in any community that's been decimated and is trying to come back, there are a lot of abandoned buildings that some of which have historic nature and other probably do, but we don't know about it, that could be renovated. Renovation is when one compares as an architect renovation versus the building of reconstruction, the delta between those two is getting smaller and smaller. Because to take an existing building, and this is a good thing, but to make it fully handicapped accessible, to provide the heating and cooling systems that are more sophisticated and more energy savings, are that much more difficult to do in an existing building than in a new building. On the other hand, from a carbon footprint standpoint, it is better to renovate a building than it is to start all over again. So it's very interesting you saying about knowing what you have. I am not aware that there is a database of properties that are either owned by the state or the city that would be available to start to understand how those could be renovated and what their locations are. But that kind of data would be really invaluable to understand because, as I said very quickly, there's so little property available that is affordable for not-for-profit developers to create housing or other facilities from. And right now they're really dependent on who they happen to know or what the real estate community is.
Thank you.
I will say that the tax on Staten Island, there have been many tax abatements, and the preservation community, I know DC is here, that has always been an issue that renovating an older home never got the same tax abatements that new construction, and it was, as Staten Island was the fastest growing borough in new housing starts, there were 8-year abatements that made it so easy to build, but New York State doesn't have it for tax abatements, and that is an issue with some going in. They're just daunted by finding the capital to start a project.
Yeah, and I think that there's a lot of smoke and mirrors with landmarks, that people don't understand. There's not clarity after owning a landmark for many years.
And I think, yes, and I think there's a misconception that you have to turn back time.
Exactly.
And they get nervous, and I, as a preservationist, say, you're supposed to drive 55 driving fast, no one can say anything. So if I think they're not making you turn back time. You can make tweaks. It's just that landmarks helps preserve a neighborhood or a house in totality, so it can change over time. And they also think it can change. Some districts, they put on full extensions. Or in Brooklyn, they put on a whole modern extension in the back, and that can all happen within a landmark district.
There's also a big difference between a local landmark and something listed on the National Register of Historic Places. And I don't even expect the average person to know the ins and outs of these different things, but the ability to communicate these differences effectively is the difference between a property being considered as, let's say, federal funding comes through for anything, housing, disaster recovery, so forth. Anything that's on the National Register gets flagged and gets assessed as to whether there's going to be any adverse effect and whether that funding can be of value in their rehabilitation. But if it's not inventoried, if it's not potentially listed, or any of those things, it just gets bypassed.
Amy touched on this in her presentation with the need to keep it very quiet about low-income housing. The question is there a way to thread the development needle between community resistance to change and underdevelopment and neglect? Maybe
I can speak to that a little bit. I mean, I think, as everybody noted, it's a really tough, and I think part of it is having those relationships at the beginning of the process where possible, so it isn't that feeling of someone swooping in, coming, doing something, and leaving. But I think it's also about, from the development perspective, from the city perspective, really focusing on creating not just an individual housing development, but a kind of community, so that we're thinking about also services and infrastructure. We hear a lot of the time that you can't build housing here because there's no infrastructure for it. So part of that is also building the infrastructure and also thinking about the services that residents want. And then, as another of the panelists mentioned, I think it's also about expanding the conversation where possible. You know, if you just put up a sign or a website and say, I'm going to be speaking about this project at this time, the same voices will often come and dominate the conversation. So whenever possible, going to meet residents where they are, going to events that are already happening so that you get other perspectives, because I think, there are a lot of people who are in favor of development and understand we're in a housing crisis.
I have one last question, and this is pretty high on my agenda, but how have environmental conservation efforts, such as rewilding, brownfield mitigation, interacted and impacted your work? Because it's really important on Staten Island, and I, of course, know John for a long time, many years, and I think I'd love you to start with this question. Oh, sorry, John.
I touched upon it, and I think as my professional and private work, but the rewilding, and I mentioned, you had the slide about the Serpentine Ridge. So if you remember Staten Island, and it is where the intersection of the wealthy and the non, but the Serpentine Ridge, for those uneducated or not familiar with it, is the part of, there's a ridge that runs through Staten Island. So when you look at Staten Island from the ferry, that highland it's a serpentine ridge, serpentine rock. If you look under a microscope, it looks like a serpentine. Serpent's skin is the ridge that goes from the ferry all the way out to Lighthouse Hill. On the North Shore, there's a steep escarpment. City planning, and we've been involved with this, and Hammer knows, but there were the properties that couldn't be developed. They were very steep. There's hillside protection, so there's a lot of things that came into play because they remained undeveloped because they were a sheer drop, and I think your first slide talked about the bluffs overlooking the Hudson. So we've now expanded, we've written letters, there's about a total of 20 acres, private and city-owned, that they're looking to turn over to Forever Wild. Some are owned by DCAS. DCAS is the Department of Citywide Administrative Services. It owns 9 acres, and it surrounds, the league did a walk, it surrounds Park Lane, which is a little enclave of small houses designed in the 30s, that we did a walk, but surrounding this, unbeknownst to me, are these great old trees, and it's not crap, in parks like crappy woodland, it's great majestic trees, oaks, maple. So that question is yes, that there is, we've changed our mission statement. It's a historic built environment. Now we're looking at protecting the natural environments. Protectors of Pine Oak Woods is a open space conservation group, so we kind of collaborate. Oh, and it goes back to, these are EJ communities, so on the downward slope, and it's, again, my head was spinning when I saw the red line. On the downward slope, it is the classic red line Stapleton, and the upper part was the green. So, I mean, they're literally butting each other. And that's the legacy on Staten Island, which I pointed in my slide. You've got manufacturing, residential. There's no buffer, there's no commercial. Anywhere else, there's it fades back from manufacturing, commercial to residential. Staten Island, it's like cheek to jowl. So that's something we've done. So there is that where they're trying to get these properties to be protected, and then just the redevelopment of the waterfront to get rid of these noxious former brownfields. And New Jersey, if you're familiar with it, is so far ahead, and New York is still slowly getting there. But
Can I open it up to audience Q&A now?
Yes,
I would love
please.
to be able to do that. Right, so I know that you were going to facilitate that, but also our mic wasn't working, and I think we can all hear each other. So yeah, let's open it up to questions from the audience. It's been a hot day. It's cooler in here, but
yeah,
you
we don't
know.
want to leave.
To break the ice, I'll say that if you've never listened to Wu-Tang, because that's generationally not your music, there's a lot in their lyrical content about the environment of Staten Island and the activism around it. So
We should have had a soundtrack.
we could have included it in the soundcheck. So that should absolutely be our reception.
Race and equity as it relates to preservation and opportunity, generational wealth building. If you take out your phone, I don't know if you have, and take a picture of the QR code, there's a page that our partners at Open House New York have. It's not comprehensive. There is a lot of dialogue going on about how to continue to do this work in all communities to better understand some of the history, some of the legacy, but also how thick the challenges are to get to a point where we can talk about specific points of preservation that need more people to know about them, to take action, to contribute what they can. John's a volunteer. I think preservation needs that. Also, technical assistance is super important. Support for technical assistance, all those aspects of preservation, and partnering with the development community so that there's a recognition that this past doesn't just go away as you create the future. So, yeah.
90 seconds. And I just want to thank you all for this timely, important, and passionate conversation. How many Staten Islanders do we have here tonight? Great. Thank you guys. Thank you guys for being here. And Fallon inspired me to think of a Wu-Tang lyric. I've been racking my brain, and the best I can come up with is "Cash rules everything around me," which I think is relevant to conversations, right, about preservation, development, neighborhood change. And now I can say I dropped a Wu-Tang lyric at a panel discussion at the Center for Architecture. My name is Kristen LaBuzz. I'm the Executive Director of Open House New York. We're a nonprofit that provides unparalleled access to the city to help New Yorkers understand why the city looks and feels and functions the way it does. Access can take many forms. Sometimes it's a hard hat tour. Sometimes it's a policy conversation with the city commissioner, and sometimes it's a really engaging panel discussion like we had tonight. So please join me in a round of applause for our panelists, for John, for Amy, Fallon, Esmeralda, and Victoria. And thank you. I want to acknowledge not just sharing your expertise tonight, but the work you guys are doing every day around planning, research, education, building, designing, and programming that really shapes our city. Of course, programs like this take a village, so I want to thank our hosts, the Center for Architecture, our presenting partners, the AIA New York committees, and our friends at the Historic Districts Council. And then a very special shout out to Jessica and Beth for making this program happen. In keeping time, although we went over because everybody's very passionate. If you enjoyed tonight's conversation, stay tuned. We have more. We are hitting up all 5 boroughs. We've done Manhattan and Staten Island. On deck, we have Brooklyn, Queens, and the Bronx. Planning is in progress, so we will hopefully be announcing those dates very soon. And then I'm also proud to share that as a nonprofit devoted to exploring place in the city, we're excited to take this conversation to the neighborhood. So Open House New York will be partnering with Historic Districts Council to do some walking tours in each of the boroughs related to preservation and redlining in partnership with local preservationists and community leaders. And then last but not least, I hope you'll join us for Open House New York Weekend. That is our citywide festival, October 18th and 20th. Amy and Victoria have been longtime partners. It's a great way to explore all 5 boroughs of the city, but I especially encourage you after tonight to explore Staten Island during this festival. And I just checked the temperature right before I got on stage. It has climbed down to 87 degrees. So again, thank you guys for being here. Stay cool. Get home safe.